Okay, we're at 2:05. So we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for being here with us. And I will continue to be monitoring it. So hi, my name is Ari Jones. My pronouns are they, them, their. I am the programs chair with the Bay Area Lawyers for Individual Freedom, also known by the acronym BAILIF. We are the oldest LGBTQI bar association in the United States. I encourage you to check out bailiff.org for more information about BAILIF, or please feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. During the presentation, all the participants will be muted with your video turned off. Please go ahead and keep your video off. That makes sure that we can maintain a good feed for you all. If at any time you'd like to submit a question, please feel free to put that in the chat, either to everyone or to me directly. You can just send that to the host or to Bailiff Administrator. You'll see that in the chat list. You can also indicate that you would like the presentation to go faster, slower if you use the participants function, but it's probably easier to just send me a chat. You can also send me a question at programs@bailiff.org, the same email address you've been using to communicate with me. I will compile all of the questions for the question and answer portion of the presentation at the end. We will try to get to all of your questions, but if for some reason we don't, please feel free to contact me directly, again, at programs@bailiff.org, or we'll also have the contact information up for both of our presenters, so their information is available there as well. After the webinar, I will be emailing everyone a certificate of attendance for the CLE and an evaluation form, which you will then email to Robin Halligan, who is the legal training manager at Squire Patton Boggs. And at the end of the webinar, I will also give you the affirmation code for this CLE, which you will need to write down and fill in on the certificate of attendance in order to get CLE credit. Now, just a couple of words about our sponsors. Thank you so much to the Bar Association of San Francisco, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, Northern California chapter, and the Alameda County Bar Association for co-sponsoring and spreading the word about this program. And a special thanks to Squire Patton Boggs for providing CLE credit, sponsoring this event, and also presenting. We are very, very grateful. I'd like to turn it over to Raphael for a moment.
Hi, Raphael Langrosuna, they, them pronouns. As a partner at Squire and a new board member at Bailiff, I'm just here to extend you all an official thank you all for joining us today. And with that, I will turn it back.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to our first presenter, Lily Zheng. Turn it over to you, Lily. Unmuted.
Hey, folks.
There we go.
Awesome. Now I can talk. Hey, folks. I'm really glad to be here today. I will be presenting the first hour or so of this presentation, and I believe I will make a little hand sign when I want you to switch the slides, if that's all right. All right, so let's get started to the first few slides. Those are the sponsors. That's us. Yeah, so hi, I'm a DE&I consultant, mostly working in the Bay right now. I'm based in Mountain View. It's very hot today. It's extremely warm, this apartment, so I might take this blazer off at some point. And I have been working with large companies on their big initiatives around building more inclusive cultures, better policies and practices around race, gender, sexuality, etc., for about 4 or 5 years now. I'm really excited to be here today, and we have a pretty jam-packed workshop. So here's a quick roadmap of some things we're going to cover. We're going to be starting with terms and concepts to know. I'm going to be going through, a very brief 101 of some of the terms I'm going to be using during this presentation. Next, I'm going to be talking about the experiences of trans people at work, drawing from some of the stories that I've heard through my own research and my own experience. Next, I'm going to be sharing a little bit about bias and how we need to consider the bias of the society we live in and our biases ourselves. as we try to navigate what it means to make a better world for trans people in the legal workplace. And finally, I'm going to be sharing some policies and practices for trans inclusion at work. Now on this slide, it does say Q&A after that. I believe there will be one quick section by Lila before that. So we're then going to go to Lila, and then questions will be at the end. So yeah, without further ado, let's get started. The first section is terms and concepts to know. So during this section, I'm going to start by reviewing some key terms, and then I'm going to be covering 3 of the biggest concepts and takeaways you'll need to know when engaging with trans issues. So the first of these terms is gender identity. So gender identity refers to an individual's internal gender label for themselves and their understanding of what that means to them. It includes common labels like man or woman or non-binary. And the interesting thing about these identities is that everyone has a different internal definition of exactly what that label means, right? You ask 10 men what man means, and they'll all give you a different understanding of it. And that's because our internal gender identity is unique to ourselves. The next concept is gender expression. So gender expression refers to our external gender presentation in the form of our appearance and behavior. So that can cover things like our hairstyle, our makeup, if we choose to wear makeup, what kind of clothes we wear, what kinds of shoes we wear, how we decide to present ourselves in terms of body language, voice. So gender expression covers all of these external aspects of ourselves, and there is literally an infinite number of different combinations you can have of different gender expressions. For example, I'm wearing right now a bodysuit with a zipper and a blazer, but it would be a very different gender expression if I was here wearing a dress. Okay, next. So next is gender norms. So gender norms are the widely held ideas and beliefs in our society about the proper gender expressions for each gender identity. So gender norms refer to things like the fact that we aren't typically very comfortable yet in the United States with men who wear lipstick, right? That is not a gender norm in our society. On the other hand, we are more familiar with men who, for example, choose to grow out their facial hair, and less comfortable with women who choose to do so. So gender norms refer to these expectations, these widely held expectations about what the proper gender expression means. These norms have changed a lot in the last few decades, in the last few hundred years, and they're constantly evolving today. But it's important to discuss how different norms make it so different types of gender expressions are more or less accepted. Next, so sex assigned at birth. Now, you might have heard of a term before called biological sex. We don't typically use that terminology nowadays. Nowadays, if we do need to talk about genitalia, we typically talk about sex assigned at birth, which refers to the sex designation that a doctor gives to an individual at birth based on their assessment of that individual's chromosomes, hormones, and external genitalia. It's actually not a very clear-cut concept, which we can certainly talk about at some point. The social construction of biological sex is a very long topic, and it was about half a chapter in the book that I wrote. So I'm happy to geek out about that if anyone has questions about it at the end. Intersex, so this is just one of the variations beyond the male and female binary, but it describes people born with variations in sex characteristics that do not fit typical definitions of male and female bodies. I can elaborate more on that in the Q&A if anyone's interested. Cisgender, so cisgender or cis is a term that describes any person who identifies as the same gender as the one they were assigned at birth. And currently, the presentation seems to be showing the Zoom window. Ari.
Sorry, Lily. Yeah, give me 1 second.
No worries. So meanwhile, I'll just talk about cis people. Cisgender basically refers to anyone that was assigned, let's say, male at birth and currently identifies as a man, or someone who was assigned female at birth and currently identifies as a woman.
Are we good now? Are we back on there?
Yep, we're all good.
Thank you.
So transgender or trans. So trans is an umbrella term that describes any person who identifies as a gender different from the gender they were assigned at birth. So trans people can identify as literally anything. There's a very large variation of different gender identities, but the key thing to know here is that it's a big umbrella that refers to anyone that's not cis. Next, non-binary, NB also. It's an umbrella term that describes any identity outside of the traditional man and woman. So non-binary can refer to someone who identifies as right in the middle between man and woman. It can refer to someone that identifies outside of the gender binary altogether. It's replaced the term genderqueer as the sort of dominant way of referring to people that are neither man nor woman. And it's a term that's really risen in popularity in the last 4 or 5 years. And finally, gender diverse. There's also many variations of this term. You might have seen gender expansive or gender variant. There's no right way to describe this, but gender diverse is a term that I use to refer to any gender identity, expression, or experience outside of the traditional man and woman. And that covers quite a lot of people. So yeah, so we're through with these definitions. There's some big ideas that I want everyone to take away from this. The first one is that sexuality is not gender identity, is not gender expression. This was actually one of the most common mistakes that people made several years ago when trans topics first started being talked about in the mainstream, is people would mix these three concepts up. They would say, well, you know, what's the difference between being transgender and being gay, for example? And all of these different concepts are separate. I'm getting an echo, Ari. So it's important that we think about all of them separately, because we can't know who someone loves or who they are on the inside from what they look like. And you know what follows from this is that really anyone can look like anything and love anyone and identify as any gender, right? It's a big world out there. So that's a really, really big takeaway that I want y'all to take away from this. The next idea is all of us challenge gender norms in some way. This is a critical one. This is actually one that when I talk with my clients takes a little bit of time to unpack. But the reality is not a single person in this call matches up to society's stereotypical perfect idea of what a traditional man or a traditional woman looks like, precisely because these ideas are stereotypes. These gender norms are all stereotypes. And so whether it's because we look a little different, whether we act in ways that go against gender norms, all of us actually challenge gender norms in some way. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think it's a really important lens to understand and empathize with trans people. Because I don't want us to come away from this conversation thinking that trans people are this separate group way off in the distance that we're going to try to understand, but rather try to understand trans people as an extension, as people that are experiencing an extension of a very common experience that many of us face, which is the fact that we challenge gender norms that do not fully encompass the human experience. And finally, the last idea is that there are many ways to exist outside of the traditional binary of man and woman. So this represents a big shift in the conversation about trans people that's happened more or less in the last 4 or 5 years in the mainstream. This idea that there are many ways to be in the world that don't involve being a man or a woman. And so we're seeing more and more people in the media, we're seeing celebrities, we're seeing actors really challenge these notions and really start doing things like publicly identifying themselves with they them pronouns, or challenging the sorts of clothing that they're expected to wear. We're seeing they them pronouns become normalized in our public discourse, and all of this represents this big cultural shift that we're experiencing, where there are now more ways to exist outside of this binary. It's a really exciting time, honestly.
Lee, can I interrupt for just 1 second to make sure I can access the chat while we're on? Okay. If I'm on this screen, can you see my Zoom screen?
Nope.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. We're good.
Fantastic. So now that we've got our terms and concepts through, I'm going to share a little bit about experiences of trans people at work. So during this section, I'm going to be talking a little bit about research that's been done on trans communities, and I'll be sharing a few stories from my book, Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace. I have a copy of it here. It was published just last year. So let's start off by talking a little bit about the research. If we go to the next slide. So the percentage, 30%. So this number is the percentage of trans people fired, denied a promotion, or otherwise mistreated in the workplace due to their gender identity or gender expression. And this is a really large number. This data comes from the 2015 US Trans Survey, the largest study of trans people done to date. And just keep in mind that this number is almost certainly underestimating the prevalence of discrimination. Many instances of discrimination were felt, but not seen. It's very hard to prove when someone is discriminating against you for being trans. And especially if you're a trans woman, if you're a trans woman of color, it's very difficult also to separate different experiences of discrimination, you know, whether someone's discriminating against you for being a woman or for being a trans person or for being a trans person of color or some combination of all of these. So the fact remains that discrimination is ubiquitous. You know, so many members of the trans community face discrimination in the workplace in some form. I'm going to take us to one more statistic. That is 75%. So what does this statistic mean? 75% is the percentage of trans people who take steps to hide their identities or sacrifice professional opportunities to avoid workplace discrimination. This is a sobering number. This number surprises me every single time that I read it. What it means is that a solid 3/4 of trans people compromise who we are, often to great harm and injury to ourselves, in order to avoid discrimination. So this might involve using a different name or pronoun at work than the one that feels most comfortable. It might involve wearing clothing that doesn't match who we are and behaving in order to fit in rather than bringing our full selves to work. It goes without saying that doing this not only, you know, is less authentic to ourselves, but really impacts our work too. It's very difficult to produce, you know, productive, effective work when we're constantly having to hide who we are. But this number is huge. It speaks to the reality of trans discrimination that it's so high in the first place. So with these two numbers in mind, I'm going to be sharing a couple stories. The first story is Rowan's. And Rowan was someone who we talked to for our book. And they were based in the Bay Area. They worked for a tech company when we talked to them. And what we found really interesting about their experience was that right before the interview, they had just started varying their gender presentation at work. Rowan uses they, them pronouns, by the way. And so sometimes at work, they would come in wearing the usual, you know, tech bro uniform, a hoodie, jeans, t-shirt underneath, and they were treated pretty well. They were treated in a way that wasn't particularly stand out. But what happened is on certain days, they would switch their presentation up. They might come to work wearing, you know, a padded bra, wearing a skirt, wearing some light makeup. And what they found was that their workplace experience was drastically different depending on which day they came to work and what they were wearing. They found that on days where they were wearing more feminine clothing, they were not listened to. Their opinions were ignored. They were micromanaged more. And so suddenly they started experiencing this very strange discrimination. And on top of that, their HR representative walked up to them and said, hey, what's going on? You need to pick a gender. You need to sort whatever it is you're dealing with out and present consistently. And Rowan said, no, I feel comfortable doing this. I feel comfortable varying my gender presentation. And so eventually this HR representative became one of Rowan's, you know, most vehement harassers in the workplace. This representative would constantly, you know, threaten punishments of some sort if Rowan didn't change what outfits they wore, especially when they were going to external recruiting events. And so eventually this became a huge cause of concern for Rowan. It was really impacting their mental health, and they went to their manager. They told their manager, right, that they were experiencing this discrimination, that this HR representative was harassing them, that they were being told to change what they wore, that there was an incident where they had a pride flag taken down from their desk because it went against office policy for whatever reason. And their manager took one look at Rowan and said, you know, I'm sure I could help you out on this, but I can only do this so many times. Are you sure you want to use one of your chances on this? And that response so surprised Rowan because, you know, discrimination is not something that you get 3 tickets to deal with and then you're out, right? Like, discrimination is something that companies should always be against. That is literally stated in the policy of many companies that they just do not tolerate. And this manager made it clear to Rowan that he would not help. And so this was the primary factor in Rowan's decision to quit, to leave. And we ended up following up and asking, what happened? Why didn't you why didn't you file a complaint? What was wrong? Clearly this was a bad instance of discrimination. And what Rowan told us is, are you kidding me? There's so few trans people doing the type of work that I do that everyone would know immediately. I would never be able to get a job again. Why would I report? And that story really stuck with us. Now, the next story I'm going to share is by a woman named Leslie. Now, Leslie worked for a big biotech firm in the Bay Area, and her experience was very different. In many ways, it follows the sort of stereotypical narrative which we've heard about trans people in the workplace. And this is a relatively positive story. She initially learned that she wanted to transition by talking to the employee resource group at her company. And she learned that her company had a large variety of, transition resources. They had a policy, they had guidelines, HR was well equipped. And so Leslie talked to her manager, talked to HR, and said, I want to go through this process. And over the next 4 or 5 months, she went through a relatively straightforward process whereby she changed her name, she changed her legal information, her legal gender, and her office got training, trans-related training for her team. She came back to work, all the systems were updated with the new name and gender, and everyone referred to her by her new name and pronouns. And so Leslie had a really positive experience. She did feel afterwards that there was a lot of pressure on her because in her experience, it felt like there was such a narrow path that if she deviated in some way, she would be seen as sort of giving up the privileges that she was afforded by having access to these resources. But Leslie's is an interesting story because it describes to us some of the benefits and also the potential pitfalls of having a very regimented trans set of resources, right? A set of resources for trans people. Because if Leslie had been a little different, if Leslie had had different transition goals, we'd really wonder how supportive her company would have been. As it stands, she had a really good time. She had a positive experience and, was really able to transition in the ways that she wanted. Now, the final story I'm going to be sharing is of Cassidy. Cassidy was a legal consultant who used they, them pronouns at the time we talked to them. And they first worked in biotech. They didn't come out as trans to their colleagues because they were worried that they would be discriminated against, and later chose to leave and go into consulting, mostly because of the greater degree of flexibility that would afford them, and also because they weren't really sure how much they wanted to be working during a time of transition in their life. But what Cassidy went through is they ended up working at 2 sort of sister law firms that were very, very similar to one another. And as researchers, we were extremely excited to hear this story because we got to see more or less a direct comparison of an inclusive workplace versus a non-inclusive workplace. In the first workplace, their supervisor really discriminated a lot against Cassidy. This woman supervisor would actually forbid them from making calls to clients, saying that the pitch of their voice was read too high for a man and that they sounded like, and these are her words, a valley girl. These comments really messed with Cassidy and really hurt their confidence in their work, and also just made it a rough working environment in general. Cassidy didn't feel like they were being seen as they actually were. They felt like their work was being micromanaged, and they constantly felt like their trans identity was, sort of made them less in the workplace. Now, in their second workplace, not much was different except for the fact that their manager was very, very supportive. And what this manager did wasn't anything special. He simply talked to Cassidy before Cassidy joined and said, hey, I want to know what pronouns you want to use in this workplace. And in that workplace, Cassidy said he, him. And so the manager said, okay, I'm going to make sure to keep that in mind. And on the very first day of work, Cassidy's boss introduced them to the team and said, this is Cassidy. He's going to be joining us. I want everyone here to treat him with respect. And that was a very simple act. It was very straightforward. But Cassidy reported that that single act of inclusion was enough to set the norms for everyone, was enough to help everyone understand that they should be using the same pronouns for Cassidy. And they had a really good experience in that workplace. So I was really interested in learning more about Cassidy's experience because Cassidy worked in 2 law firms. And as I was getting ready for this presentation, I was thinking, that story just isn't enough, right? I want more. I want to learn more about trans attorneys and lawyers, and I wanted to learn more about what trans attorneys and lawyers faced. We're going to be hearing a little more about that from Lila too, and also some cases of what the current policy is like. But I found a recent study done in 2018 that specifically looked into trans attorneys and lawyers, which was a jackpot. And it found that there are 3 core issues. The first is that trans attorneys and lawyers face feelings of isolation and a lack of mentorship. The second refers to challenges with how state licensure boards maintain and amend name and gender markers. And the third is small acts of exclusion or microaggressions and lack of understanding from coworkers. And all of this actually matches up to experiences that we saw talking to trans folks for our book as well. Because the lack of mentorship and isolation is ubiquitous, right? It's so difficult for trans people to find other trans folks in the companies that they work for. They're often the only one. And being the only one of anything, whether the only woman, the only person of color, the only disabled person, the only trans person, really, really impacts your performance and your feeling of belonging. And the third one here is also a pretty common experience, small acts of exclusion in terms of microaggressions. This is a very common experience as well, right? The trans folks who we talk to would share stories about people messing up their names slightly too many times to be an accident. They talked about people making very subtle comments that they should be dressing differently or that they should be wearing certain clothing different from that. Trans men would get comments like, you really need to man up, or you should really be lifting more, or if a woman can lift that, why can't you lift that? And other similar sorts of comments that would help, or that would have them feel like they were less in the workplace. So with all of this said, right, what are we going to do about it? And that brings us to our next section, which is understanding individual and cultural bias. This is a really, really important concept to me. I think what we have a tendency to do as individuals is to think of people as either discriminatory or not. And so oftentimes when I talk to clients about this kind of work, they ask first and foremost for a list. They say, please just tell me what I can say and not say. Give me a list of 10 words that are bad and 10 words that I should be using instead. I just want to get this done with so I can go back to work. And I would argue that this approach isn't particularly helpful, because it's not that there are just a few bad eggs out there that are being discriminatory. It's that all of us, trans people included, me included, you included, have internalized some ideas from our society about gender, about trans people, about the fire truck outside of my window. And these ideas, right, are things that affect all of us. These ideas are things that we need to unpack if we're trying to create a better society. So there are 3 big ones that I'm going to be sharing with you today. The very first is the gender binary. So the gender binary is at the heart of all of this. And what I refer to when I say gender binary is the idea that men are one way and women are another, the ideas that certain roles are better suited for men or for women, and the idea that there are only two genders and nothing outside or in between. All of these ideas are actively harmful, right? Because when we see a person, right, we've internalized the gender binary so much that one of the very first unconscious choices we make is to assign someone a gender label in our heads, right? Even if we don't even see their face, even if we see just their name, we immediately start assigning a gender. We think, you know, is this person a man or a woman? And these assumptions, right, guide so many other things in our brains. This is the way that unconscious bias works. We jump to conclusions and then we link these categories with other ideas in our head, right? So let's say I'll see someone named Sarah, and without having met them, without even having seen anything about their behavior or maybe even their face, I'll assume that they're a woman. I'll assume, you know, what they look like. I'll assume that their hair is long. I'll assume that maybe it's blonde. I'll assume so many things that, like, in some ways I can't even help because I've internalized these ideas. And it's this unconscious gender bias, this idea of the gender binary, that is so harmful when it's not unpacked. When we don't think in a critical way about the gender binary, we hurt not just trans people, but in fact cis people. We hurt everyone, everywhere, when we make assumptions about gender. So, for example, cisgender men are mocked for crying or taking parental leave because, you know, that doesn't fit into our ideas of what the ideal man's supposed to be. Women are frowned on for being the primary breadwinner or taking charge or being assertive, right? These are all toxic gender norms. Now, trans people face the brunt of this because we're often the most visible. So when trans women are called men in dresses, that's a result of cisgender people refusing to recognize that women can look like anything. And when non-binary people are told to pick a gender, that's a result of cisgender people not understanding that there's more than two options. In some way, you know, these ideas challenge our conception of what the world should be like, and thus they're threatening, right? I've talked to many folks in the last 4 or 5 years about the gender binary, and a consistent theme that I've heard is that is the idea that if there's more to the gender binary, then why am I doing what I'm doing? And this is such a universal idea, right? I talked to women who spent thousands and thousands of dollars on makeup, for example, because they felt like they needed to conform. And so whenever they saw women in the workplace doing well without makeup, they felt cheated. They felt threatened. They wondered why it is that they had to conform while other people didn't. And it's a very similar idea. It's a very similar sort of process that happens when cis people view transgender people. They think, why is it that you can challenge gender in this way? And instead of thinking, maybe I can too, they think there must be something wrong with you. So that's one of the big cultural biases that makes all of these challenges harder. The next is respectability. Now, respectability politics refers to the idea that we treat people according to the degree to which they appear respectable in our eyes. So inevitably, this is tied into how people look, how they dress, how they sound, and how they act, right? I'm sitting here in front of you wearing a blazer. It would be very different if I was sitting here wearing, let's say, a dirty t-shirt and saying the exact same things. And the reality of it is that despite how much we might claim that our society is meritocratic, that we treat people on the basis of what they do, of, you know, how well they work or how productive they are, respectability continues to be a very dominant idea, especially in certain industries and fields. So, you know, for example, what happens if a lawyer is wearing a t-shirt and not a suit? What if they have naturally growing locks instead of blonde hair or an afro? What if their voice sounds differently than what you'd expect? At the end of the day, right, what we've done in many of these industries is tie respect to arbitrary cues that are just far easier for some people than others to meet. And so when we look at the people that are most hurt by respectability, it turns out, you know, respectability hurts the poor, right? Maybe they can't afford the right clothing. Women, right? Maybe women can't, or maybe women are forced to act like men to get respect. The LGBTQ+ community, right? Maybe we present ourselves or challenge gender, or look and sound and act in different ways than is considered respectable. People of color, Muslim people, disabled people, and so on and so forth. Respectability is a toxic concept when we don't unpack it, right? And this is the idea that drives many of our biases against all sorts of things, not just trans people, right? This also relates to racial discrimination, to gender discrimination, to disability discrimination. And so we need to unpack respectability if we're trying to resolve issues in our workplaces around all of these different groups. Now, finally, the last large cultural idea that I want to bring up is status and stereotypes. So what does this mean? Well, what we found when we did our research was that people held a number of lingering stereotypes about trans people even before they had met a single trans person in person. And so all of these stereotypes are things that we have picked up from the cultural context around us. Maybe we've seen, a TV show that puts a main character who's a man in a dress and laughs at him. And we learn, oh, when people who look like men are in dresses, that's silly, that's absurd, that's ridiculous, that's something we should laugh at. So we've internalized all of these ideas about trans people and people that challenge gender norms, that somehow they're less competent, less committed, less serious, or even less moral, right? In large part, it's because we've grown up in a cultural context that doesn't give trans people the respect they deserve. You can look beyond media to even, look to high-profile news cases recently. Last year and for a few years now, there's always been a media buzz around so-called bathroom bills that have tried to place restrictions on who can use, public bathrooms. They've been ridiculous, and every single, bathroom bill has involved a campaign to portray trans people as dangerous, as criminal, as being perverted, as having something wrong with them that would cause us to assault people. None of this actually lines up with any research or any data, but it plays into our cultural fears of trans people as the other, right? Trans people are over there. There's something wrong with them. They're different. They have a problem. And so even if we don't have these explicit thoughts, these explicit biases, growing up in a cultural context where we hear these stories all the time makes us internalize them, right? We grow up and we just think trans people, either they're hilarious or there's something wrong with them. And when we meet our first trans person in the workplace, we can't help but also have some of those thoughts trickle through, right? That's the unconscious bias coming in. These stereotypes that we picked up in our society get converted into discriminatory behavior, even if we're unaware about it. So I'm going to go back to a slide that I presented in the beginning, and that's sexuality is not gender identity, is not gender expression, right? If there's one thing that we're going to be picking up from all of the slides that I've been talking about so far, it's that all of these things are different. There are so many ways of being, and none of these ways are necessarily wrong, right? So if you see someone that doesn't look the way you would normally expect a person to look, right? If you see someone that challenges gender norms in some way, remember that you don't actually know anything about them yet. This doesn't mean anything. This doesn't mean that they're a good person or a bad person, that they're trustworthy or not. All you've seen, right? Let's say you see someone's gender expression. Let's say it's a person with short cropped hair, wearing a long dress with a little bit of facial hair and makeup. All you know about them is that they have short cropped hair, are wearing a dress, have a little bit of facial hair, and are wearing makeup. That's it, right? We really need to challenge these biases, which we have, right, from growing up in this society. And by the way, that it's none of our faults for having these biases, right? You and I did not ask to grow up in this society, but we have. And as important it is to recognize that we also can't give ourselves the excuse of saying, well, then I can be discriminatory because I grew up in a discriminatory society. We can do better. We can do much better. And so one of these big ideas that I want everyone to internalize here is You can't know who someone loves or who they are from what they look like. It's very simple. Next is all of us challenge gender norms in some way. So we've talked about a whole lot so far. We've talked about how, the gender binary isn't real. We've talked about how respectability gives us these unrealistic norms for race and gender and sexuality and ability that discriminate against people that can't meet these standards. And, I want folks here to think about trans issues as something that we can all be in solidarity about, right? All of us have some experience to gender in some way. All of us probably have some experience being marginalized in some way because of our gender expression or our gender identity or something that we've done that's gone against traditional ideas about how men should be or how women should be, right? We're all in this together. Now, the last one, right? There are many ways to exist outside of the binary of man and woman. There are so many ways of being, right? Especially non-binary people, who are challenging things today. These folks often face so much vitriol and a lack of acceptance from the world around us in both, a political context, a cultural context, and a workplace context too. Remember the stories which I told where trans people were basically forced by HR to pick a gender, to choose one. They were basically told that they, them pronouns and being non-binary was not a real way of existing and told to conform to outdated ways of identifying, right? This is awful for, ensuring that your employees care about the workplace, for productivity, for all sorts of things, through every single metric possible. It's just a bad idea to be forcing your employees to be something that they're not at work. So, let's all keep in mind that the world is constantly changing and that there are more and more ways to exist outside of this binary. It's time for our workplaces to catch up. So what do we do about all of this, right? So I've talked about terms and concepts. I've shared a couple stories. I've talked about the cultural context that all of us live in. So now let's get to the nitty-gritty. This is what I do for my day job, right? I build policies and practices for trans inclusion at work. This is a large bulk of my work as a D&I consultant. So what are some things that you can do tomorrow, right, next week, to leverage your ability within your company to make a positive difference for transgender, non-binary, and gender non-conforming people at work? I'll be sharing some key takeaways for you and your company to keep up with the best practices and create a stronger sense of inclusion in your workplaces. So the very first set of these, implement best practices. Right now, this is the first step, and this is by no means the end, but it's a good idea to follow the industry best practices around trans inclusion as have been demonstrated by companies across the country. This means making a non-discrimination policy that protects both gender identity and gender expression. The next is building inclusive facilities like gender-neutral bathrooms, gender-neutral locker rooms. Many companies have single-stall gender-neutral bathrooms. Multi-stall is even better, right? There's new research out there which shows that having enhanced privacy features on gender-inclusive multi-stall bathrooms is even better than having a single gender-neutral bathroom. Next, self-identification systems. Give options to include identities and pronouns on name badges and inside internal systems. Make sure people can change this data if they need. I was very surprised to learn when I worked with a client that they couldn't change any data about any employee in their system, including employees who were married and wanted to change their last name. They didn't even have support for that. So on a very, very basic level, right, allow folks to change the information that's in the system. And just as a pro tip, you can make sure to be transparent about which things you can't change for legal reasons, let's say payroll, and which things you can change, preferably things that employees see on the employee side. Next, transition guidance, right? Create and write policies to give guidance for trans people who want to transition in the workplace. I'd actually just oh no, that hasn't gone up yet. But I recently published a piece in the Harvard Business review that we'll be talking about this. It should come out in the next couple days, actually, about how to make a transition guidance that will support all trans people in the workplace. But, you know, a really good guidance has flexibility. You allow trans people to choose what they need. It has very clearly listed resources and protections saying, you know, trans people have access to these benefits, you know, these healthcare benefits especially, this is what you can do, this is who you should talk to. And finally, healthcare. Healthcare is very important. Look to Starbucks for a really good model policy right now in terms of healthcare. Now, keep in mind, again, I've said all of this, just because policies and practices exist doesn't mean that the culture or the workplace is good, right? This is the bare minimum. But if you don't have this yet, this is an excellent place to start. Once you've created these policies, once you've created, you know, this foundation, it's crucial that you follow up on that to make sure that the reality of the employee experience matches up to the presence of these supportive policies, right? Are people actually following the policy? Are people actually making use of these resources? Do all managers understand that employees have access to these resources? What happens when someone discriminates against someone else and it goes against non-discrimination policy? So all of these are questions that can be answered after these best practices are implemented. Now, the next set of practices for the workplace involves securing the support of influential leaders. This is actually something that was very clear in our research. We thought at first that companies with supportive policies would do better than companies without them. And it turned out we were completely, absolutely wrong. Whether or not inclusive policy existed, the single biggest predictor of whether a trans person had a positive or negative workplace experience was their manager or an executive leader being supportive. That's it. That's all, right? An influential leader supporting a trans person was enough to make their experience really positive, even if that workplace had no policy at all. And the absence of supportive leaders, even in companies with fantastic policies, made trans people's experience extremely negative. So how do you go about securing this kind of support? Well, the first idea is tie trans inclusion into the company mission, right? If your company has any sort of pro-social mission, if it has any, you know, company values, make sure to make a strong argument linking those values to trans inclusion, right? Make an argument that says, look, if we're here to support all of our employees, that means that we need to support trans employees too, right? If we're here to support everyone thriving, then that means, you know, we can't be leaving some people behind. Next is offering effective and engaging manager training. So middle managers are often way overlooked when we talk about any kind of D&I work. You frequently have, you know, senior leadership saying very lofty things about diversity and inclusion that never really manage to trickle down into the lived reality of ICs on the ground, or, you know, entry-level workers on the ground. So the missing piece here is middle managers. So we need to offer effective and engaging manager training that can make these ideas about inclusion, about belonging, known and standardized among all managers, so that every manager understands the same things that we've been talking about here today and understands how to help their trans employees on their teams. And the very last one is activate leaders as allies, right? We can't just have trans people pushing for these things in our workplaces. That's not how change happens. And so identify leaders that have influence, that have respect, and leverage them to help you advocate. Right? Having a senior leader push hard for trans inclusivity is so much more impactful than having one or two trans people at the entry level pushing for it by themselves. And so push for things like executive sponsorship of trans initiatives, push for, you know, senior leadership participation, push for like a CEO announcement during Pride Month. Even small things can make a big impact when it comes to helping leaders feel like it's their responsibility to help create trans inclusion. So next, correct systemic biases. So I talked a little bit about bias already. I talked about cultural bias and individual bias. Well, there's one other kind that I haven't mentioned yet, and that is systemic bias. And that is bias that has been embedded and internalized within the structures, or, you know, companies rather, that we work in. And so When we have policies, for example, that lock in the idea of screening people for culture fit, right? That is one example of a way in which bias has been embedded into our system, into our policies. And so there are many such policies that discriminate against trans people within a corporate setting. One very common example is phone interviews that don't have very clear criteria for determining whether a client is good or not. And why is that a problem? Well, if you know you're going to be talking to a Susan or a Jennifer on the phone, and it's someone with a much lower voice than you expect, you might be thrown off by that. Your unconscious biases might start creeping in, and you might think, there's something wrong here. I don't like this person. I'm not going to pass them through to the next level. And if your phone interview process, for example, doesn't require you to justify your choices by criteria, your bias will have a real-world impact of discriminating against this trans person. Now, on the other hand, if you do something as simple as saying, justify every hiring decision you make through these criteria, right, then you've now put in a practice that interrupts that bias, that forces that person to say, oh, wait, the pitch of their voice has nothing to do with what they just said, right? You can interrupt some of that immediate, gut feeling, oh, women aren't supposed to sound like that, therefore something's wrong. So how do you do this scalably? The first is to seek out trans input to expand trans representation, right? Very simply put, hire more trans people, work with trans people to make sure that the content you're producing, the communications you're putting out, is on point for engaging with trans people on trans topics. This is especially important because we're about to hit June, Pride Month, or as I call it, lots of companies messing up on talking to trans people month. This is the perfect month for folks to be working with trans people on figuring out how their companies can get better in terms of both representation and in terms of embedded systemic bias. Next, patch leaky talent pipelines. I just talked a bit about this with regards to phone interviews and hiring. There are so many ways in which trans talent is either not being tapped or being let go at a much faster rate, or just not making it through the system. And this is a travesty, right? Many companies will say, look, we would love to hire trans people, but they're just not there. And that is completely false. There are so many trans people qualified for every industry, but the major challenges that companies face is that their systems have been designed for cis people. And so the cumulative results of all of the kinds of discrimination that I just mentioned add up, and it results in trans people being underrepresented and mistreated within companies. Now, finally, create an inclusive culture for all gender identities and expressions. So it's very, very important that we don't just focus on getting trans people in. I spend a lot of time with clients who say, okay, I get it, right? My company has 0 trans people, we'll get 1, we'll get 2, right? Then you'll get off our case. That's not the right answer. Because what we're trying to do is to end the stories that I shared with you today, to end, these stories where people are expressing themselves in their workplace and their HR representatives are shutting them down, or their managers aren't supporting them, or their managers are making their lives even worse. We want to end this. We want to stop this from happening. And the only way this happens is by creating an inclusive culture that works for everyone. That means setting expectations. That means holding all of our leaders and all of our colleagues and peers to a standard of respect and inclusivity. And this is not easy work, right? This is long-term work. Culture is always hard. But I really do strongly believe, and it's because I do D&I work on different topics besides just trans issues, that you need this for anything, right? You need to create an inclusive culture to support any workplace that isn't just 100% cisgender, heterosexual, rich, white, able-bodied men. Any workplace that has any diversity requires this inclusive culture to thrive. And so as you're going through that work, make sure you also design for trans people. Make sure you design an openness for gender identities and gender expressions throughout your process. Now, finally, this is the daily stuff. model inclusion in your day-to-day interactions. So these are some practices which you can start doing literally after this call. These are some interpersonal strategies that I find very effective. Again, you can't just do any of these things on their own. If you only do this, number 4 list of recommendations and you don't do any of the other things, your impact will be small. All of this has to be coordinated. So what does modeling inclusion look like? Well, introduce yourself with pronouns. This is a very simple one. You can start off every conversation with introducing yourself with your own pronouns. This is actually a question that I've seen a lot. Hey, I've seen someone that looks kind of gender nonconforming. I don't know their pronouns. How do I ask them? The common answer that I give, which is not ask them, is in fact introduce yourself with your own pronouns when you talk to them. Because what that does is that signals that you care about pronouns, and if they feel comfortable, they'll share yours with you, right? Don't just walk up to the only gender nonconforming person in the room and say, what are your pronouns, when you haven't done that with anyone else, because trust me, we notice and we don't like it. Next, use they, them as default. So this is a tough one. This is actually gaining more and more popularity by the day. When I first started recommending this about 5 or 6 years ago, people hated it. And it's actually becoming more popular now. But we actually do this a lot, right? Oh, the mail just got dropped off. Oh, like, what did the mailman say? I don't know, they didn't say anything. Like, maybe just don't know their gender. Or my friend is having a child. Oh, what's the baby's gender? I don't know. Like, I don't know what their gender is. Because you're not going to casually say his or her every single time. We actually use gender neutral they, them quite often. It's actually one of the most frequently used pronouns in our language. We just don't formally do that. Also, by the way, Shakespeare used tons of it. So if you're trying to argue that this is a new thing, it is not in fact a new thing. Next, correct mistakes gracefully. We're going to mess up. I mess up all the time. I think I messed up the pronouns of my own interviewee during this call just now, right? And so it happens. Don't beat yourself up, but also be accountable for your mistake. If you've messed up, correct yourself. Don't make it about yourself. Move on and do better next time. I cannot understate the importance of moving on once you've apologized. I had a coworker in my first job several years ago that basically messed up my pronoun, used he, him, and spent 10 minutes apologizing to me, basically saying, I'm so sorry. I'm not a bad person. You have to understand, Lily. I'm so sorry. I would never be transphobic. I'm so sorry. And it eventually turned into a pity party where I had to reassure this guy that he wasn't a bad person. And it took 10 minutes of my time to just get him to shut up and stop apologizing, right? All we need is, I'm sorry. I'll do better next time, and then do better next time. Now, finally, challenge the binary yourself, right? This takes guts, but like I mentioned earlier, all of us are already challenging gender norms. Why don't we put that more out in the open? Why don't we say, you know what, it's okay that I'm a woman and I'm being agentic and taking charge? Or, you know what, it's okay that I'm a man and I want to be a primary caregiver for my children because that's what I like. Or it's okay that I have naturally growing body hair and, you know, the stereotypical gender roles say that women shouldn't. I'm tired of shaving it off. I really like it, right? So things like that. Challenge the binary yourself. Contribute to this larger movement to make gender something that works for more people. The boxes of gender that we find ourselves in are so repressing and so constricting for everyone, not just trans people, but also cis people. So I think it's in all of our best interests, you know, to make this concept, the shared cultural concept of gender, something that's bigger, something that's more flexible, something that allows for more ways of being any gender. And then, you know, like I've been mentioning, back all of this interpersonal work up with systemic work to get your leaders on board, to create better policies, to create better practices, to involve trans people into the work you do, to really try to understand them and to understand ways in which your workplaces aren't working. And that's just what we have to do, right? This is what this work means. It's a mixture of interpersonal and systemic. It's tough, but it really does help all of us.
Thank you so much, Lily. I'm going to pass it on over to Lila. Lila, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Lily. That was very informative, very helpful. Well, I am a labor and employment attorney at Squire Patton Boggs. And as part of my work, I advise my employer clients about trans issues in their workplaces. And so today, what I want to do is I want to piggyback on Lily's presentation and provide California's legal framework for employers regarding trans issues. And also, you know, this legal framework will help employees and really anyone out there better understand what the law is for the workplace regarding trans issues and what things to pay attention to, both as an employee who may be trans, but also someone who is not, but may come in, you know, may have a trans colleague or something like that. So to get started, this is the agenda. I'm not going to spend as much time talking about these things because Lily hit on them quite a bit. But you know, just as a general overview, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people are increasingly visible in society and the workplace, yet stereotypes and misunderstandings continue to persist about them. Transgender employees are particularly vulnerable to unlawful workplace conduct such as harassment, refusal to hire, privacy violations. In fact, according to the National Center for Transgender Equality, more than 1 in 4 transgender employees have lost their jobs due to bias, and more than 3/4 have experienced some form of workplace discrimination. So my goal in this presentation is to provide an overview of these issues on this slide so that you can walk away with a better understanding of trans issues in the workplace, as well as processes to implement if you are an employer, many of which Lily just spoke about. But I'll get more into the weeds on the legal side of things. So like in many other areas of the law and just in general, California is one of the most progressive states and has one of the most progressive set of laws and rules to prevent discrimination against LGBTQ employees. I believe that these laws will continue to broaden as needed based on employee experiences resulting in litigation, as well as general fluctuations in our society. So starting with the California's Fair Employment and Housing Act, otherwise known as FEHA. FEHA has long prohibited unlawful discrimination, harassment, and retaliation in the workplace based on a broad range of protected characteristics, including sex, gender identity, which specifically includes transgender status, gender expression, and sexual orientation, among others. It's important to note here that harassment does not need to be motivated by sexual desire. FEHA specifies that it's unlawful for employers to fail to take all reasonable steps necessary to prevent discrimination and harassment from occurring in the workplace. And this statement here goes back to what Lily was saying earlier. It's not enough just to have the policy in place. And oftentimes when the policy is in place, these are the employers that say, oh, well, the policy's in place. We don't need to do anything else. And that's the biggest problem right there, is its actual actions, right? Actions speak louder than words. And employers really do have this obligation to take all reasonable steps necessary. It's not enough just to have a policy. So, you know, a big thing, it seems obvious, but it's not to everybody. Identify a person as they wish. Refusing to comply with an employee's request to be identified in a certain way may subject an employer or an individual to liability under FEHA. So for example, if a trans woman changes her name and asks to be referred to as she or her, and a coworker or supervisor makes negative comments and purposefully and repeatedly uses the wrong name or pronouns, this is discrimination. I think it's important to note here before moving on that an employer is permitted to use an employee's gender or legal name listed on government-issued identification only if, but they are allowed to, if it is necessary to meet a legally mandated obligation. That's probably vague, just hearing me say that. It's very case specific, but there are circumstances when this will exist. So moving on to hiring, firing, and compensation decisions. It would seem obvious that there's no discrimination on these issues, but unfortunately, we're still seeing a lot of situations where not just based on male versus female, but of course, when we get into more specific definitions of gender identity and gender status, FEHA prohibits employers from refusing to hire or employ a person or discharge a person from employment or discrimination against them in terms of compensation or in terms, conditions, or privileges of employment. And this includes sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, or sexual orientation. Or, in addition to that, a perception that a person has any of these characteristics or is associated with a person or has or is perceived to have any of these characteristics. So California's commitment to education and prevention of harassment and discrimination based on gender and identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation is further demonstrated through changes to the mandatory sexual harassment prevention and other training. You know, part of this change was fueled by the #MeToo movement, but with that change, we're also broadened scope for what the harassment must include with regard to gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So by January 1, 2021, employers with 5 or more employees must provide now at least 1 hour of classroom or other interactive training and education on sexual harassment to all non-supervisory employees, and at least 2 hours of classroom or other interactive training and education on sexual harassment to supervisory employees. And like I said, training must now include harassment issues based on gender and identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. It also must include practical examples that address harassment based on gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So as of January 1, 2018, employers are required to post a transgender rights in the workplace poster. You can see it's very small, but this is a copy of the poster. It can be found on the DFEH website. This poster must be displayed along with other mandatory workplace notices in a prominent and accessible location in the workplace. So these other notices, you think of like notices related to minimum wage or break requirements. This notice has to be hung along with those. The Department of Fair Employment and Housing, the state agency charged with enforcing California civil rights laws, developed this poster with the stated intent that the poster hopes to increase understanding of the law and assist employers in providing a safe and inclusive work environment. So as a condition of employment, this gets kind of back to hiring. An employer cannot require proof of sex, gender, gender identity, or expression. You can inquire about or require documentation or proof of an individual's sex, gender, gender identity, or gender expression, but the employer-employee can only communicate about these topics if the employee initiates the conversation. So job applications in the hiring process, an employer is prohibited from denying employment based wholly or in part on an individual's sex, gender, gender identity, or gender expression. Refusing to provide, accept, or consider applications from individuals of one sex unless there's permissible defense is likewise unacceptable. You can't ask about the sex of an applicant on an application or any pre-employment questionnaire. There's some, very limited circumstances when this might be okay, like for record keeping purposes, but I would just steer away from it without first discussing with employment counsel. You can't discriminate based on an applicant's failure to designate male or female on an application form. It's much more common now than it ever has been before for there to be more than a male or female bubble, which is comforting. Oftentimes you see a blank so that an employee can fill this information in themselves, which is also comforting. This is the trend that we want to see more employers moving toward. And then another thing is, after an individual is hired, an employer may record the employee's sex for non-discriminatory personnel reasons, but this is something that should be in a personnel file and kept confidential along with the employee's other personnel documents. So moving on to physical appearance, dress, and grooming standards. If an employer has a dress code, it needs to be applied in a non-discriminatory manner. Reasonable workplace grooming and dress standards are okay, so long as an employee is permitted to dress consistently with their gender identity or expression. So for example, a transgender employee who identifies as a woman must be allowed to dress in the same manner as a non-transgender woman. So moving on to access to bathrooms, showers, and locker rooms. I think that, we've seen a huge shift in this area, not just at places of employment, but also, any public place such as a restaurant or a shop. We're starting to notice that single-use bathrooms are labeled as, all gender, which is what's required now. So all employees must have equal access to a comparable, safe, and adequate facility without regard to their sex. That's what the law reads. Employers must allow employees to use facilities corresponding to their gender identity or gender expression, regardless of an employee's a sex assigned at birth. And this goes back to what Lily was saying about having a workplace policy in place where an employer is implementing procedures and protocols so that there's a general understanding among employees about what is okay in the workplace, and this is something that needs to be okay. An employer cannot require an employee to undergo or provide proof of any medical treatment or procedure, or require employees to provide any identity documents to use a specific bathroom. This requirement cannot be used as a justification for any discriminatory employment decision. And an employer may make reasonable and confidential inquiry of an employee for the sole purposes of ensuring access to comparable, safe, and adequate multi-user facilities. And so again, it's okay to have the conversation, so long as it's done in a non-discriminatory manner. As I briefly mentioned, single-user toilet facilities must be identified as all gender toilet facilities and bear gender-neutral signage. So this can be unisex, it can be restroom, it can be gender-neutral, it can be all gender bathroom. What matters is that if there is a single-user toilet in a place, a business, it must be identified with one of these signs. So in the transition process, it's unlawful for an employer to discriminate against an employee who is transitioning, has transitioned, or is perceived to be transitioning. It's preferable that the employer has a transition procedure and protocol in place, and so that conversations can be had with employees beforehand and during the process, not just the employee going through the transition. And this type of process will really enable the process to go forward more smoothly, for the employee to feel supported, taken care of during that process, and also hopefully to prevent any discrimination from employees or the employer during the process. So moving on to best practices to avoid sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination claims. Lily already hit on these pretty in depth. Some of what I'm going to say are going to reiterate some of those things. Some of them will be different. I advise that you take everything that has been presented in this webinar more globally and think about them, specific to your situation as an employee or as an employer, and have a conversation with others in your workplace or with counsel about how to put a policy in place that will best support any employees in your workplace, but also which makes sense for your workplace. So employers can implement preventative measures to reduce the risk of liability by first training. So training supervisors and managers to avoid asking questions that are aimed at eliciting the applicant's sexual orientation, gender identity, or status as a transgender individual. about their plans to transition from one sex to a different sex, or about their medical history, such as whether the applicant has been diagnosed with gender dysphoria or has had any gender-related surgery or other treatment. So more training. So training supervisors on how to identify and prevent harassment related to gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And then along with supervisors, training employees. So training employees to use proper terminology when discussing matters related to gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. And then training employees to use a coworker's proper name and pronoun. Would be part of a transition process, a procedure, protocol, and something that would be developed first by having a conversation with that transitioning employee so that you best understand what that transitioning employee prefers so that you can communicate that to other employees in a way that makes sense and is supportive of that employee. So another thing is to implement a policy to assist employees who transition from one sex to a different sex. So again, Lily has gone into this in a lot of detail, more training. So we just want to train everybody. We want to make sure that everybody feels incorporated, seen, heard, supported, and to make sure that employers are following the law so that employees are not experiencing any type of discrimination that would make them feel uncomfortable and discriminated against, of course, but also to avoid lawsuits, right? Because the precursor to a lawsuit is discrimination, which means that an employee has suffered treatment that they should not have suffered. So it's really getting to the front of any issue that could arise by doing things like listening to this webinar, but then also implementing various procedures in your workplace to make sure that issues don't arise. That's all I have on the legal side. We have a lot of time for question and answers now, question and answers for either Lily or myself. Or Lily, if you have anything to add, we can also open it up.
Thank you so much, Lila. That was great. Again, a reminder that you can post questions into the chat here. You can also email me at programs@bailiff.org, and I am more than happy to take your questions that way. And again, you can post things to the chat to everyone, or you can send it to me individually as the host. I'm going to go ahead and just tell Lily and Lila I sent one question to you all via email. And I will read that out. I think it takes sort of both a practical and a legal perspective. So the question is, many of us, myself included, work for organizations that seek to be extremely trans and gender inclusive, but are having difficulty practically implementing gender inclusive facilities policies. Many of us rent space in shared buildings that have shared multi-stall bathrooms that are gendered. They do not provide complete privacy for each stall, and the quote unquote men's room has urinals. What is the best way to make these restrooms inclusive? You
So
are
this
unmuted,
is Lila.
Lily. Oh, go ahead, Lila.
Yeah, no, I would like to hear what Lily has to say about this. This is an interesting question. So from the legal side, if you're renting space in a building and you're not the actual manager of that bathroom space, right? It's a shared facility. I would first encourage you to contact the manager of the actual office, whoever is, you know, either the person, the intermediary between you and the actual office owner, or whoever your contact person has been, and raise the concern. If that doesn't get you anywhere, I would recommend that you reach out to counsel and perhaps, you know, write a letter to that person before taking it a step further. But I think it's having the conversation, because a lot of times, you know, it's unintentional discrimination, unknowing. Folks are ignorant about what the law is right now. That doesn't mean it's okay at all. But I do think that it's important to give, you know, people a notice of the problem and an opportunity to fix it before a bigger deal is made of it, because the ultimate goal is that you have a bathroom that is comfortable for you or transgender folks.
Great. Lily, it says that you're unmuted on my screen. Let me try. Is it still giving you trouble? 1 second. Okay. I have been locked from unmuting you. Give me one moment. I'm going to try stopping the share, Xing us out of this for a second. Just tried making you a co-host. Does it allow you to unmute yourself now?
Aha.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yes, so I have tons of thoughts on this in addition to what Lila was talking about. I think as a really good first practice, yes, it is really good to talk to whoever the building manager is. That's really positive. I think in my own experience, it gets a little messy, especially if, you know, not everyone in the building is in complete agreement with making every bathroom like a gender inclusive bathroom, especially if they're all multi-stall. One thing that I've seen work well in the past, and you know, there are many different solutions that can possibly work, is to label each bathroom with, for example, like the type of like putting one sign that says urinals, putting one sign that says stalls, right? That's one thing. One other practice that I've seen work pretty well is having gender inclusive multi-stall bathrooms on one floor, and then the normally gendered, you know, men's and women's bathrooms on the other floor. So you have alternating floors basically of normally binary gendered restrooms and then inclusive restrooms. The goal of that is to basically give people the option, if not everyone is comfortable with the gender inclusive bathrooms, they can go up a floor. Which I've seen work really well at Stanford. I believe Stanford does that. So that's definitely something that you can do as well, especially if building another bathroom or repurposing a bathroom just isn't in the cards. Sometimes the facility which you're working with doesn't have enough bathrooms to convert. So, you know, then it becomes a question of like, how do we make the current bathrooms, you know, acceptable for being both gender inclusive and assuaging people's privacy concerns. And so that's when you can start talking about enhanced privacy features. You can install things to extend, you know, how far the doors go down and up. I've seen that work pretty well too. But there are always, you know, creative things you can do, creative solutions that you can use that keep you in compliance and also, you know, address some of the concerns of people who might not be as comfortable or familiar with these issues. One client that I had deal with this had quite a bit of conflict between the trans employees and then their foreign employees that just came from countries where this conversation just hasn't happened yet. And they ended up using a mix of these approaches to find an approach that made everyone comfortable. So yeah, it is messy. And I think there are many things we can do before we go the route of like, this is what we need to do to be legally compliant, comply, or else lawsuit, which I tend to reserve for like the very last resort.
Thank you all. Thanks. That's great.
Oh, and there was a quick question in chat. Yeah, so D and I just say it very fast. And it's also DE and I for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I totally understand hearing it as D and I because whenever I transcribe something, the transcription software that I use always transcribes it as D and I, and I feel very self-conscious. So don't worry about that. That's my bad for saying it fast.
Here, let me skip. We have your slide. So diversity, equity, and inclusion consultant. That's great.
I also saw a question earlier in chat, further up, by Catherine Thomas. Perchance, was any data collected about what trans applicants look for initially when choosing a workplace or law firm? This is a really, really good question. We didn't collect quantitative data, but I can definitely share with you what we found qualitatively. It's complicated. Basically, the big thing to keep in mind is that trans applicants mainly use word of mouth, to be frank. Most trans people will basically ask folks who they know within that company if it's trans inclusive as their primary measure of whether that company's good. If they don't have anyone on the inside, they typically look for some sort of external gauge of how that company is doing on its trans inclusion. So it might look for things like Pride Month events. It might look for things like the HRC's Equality Index, which is like a score out of 100 that the HRC gives to companies. None of these are perfect metrics. I personally know of many companies that get a perfect 100 score on that index and are pretty bad. But you know, without having that information from word of mouth, I think these are the things that trans people rely on. Now, that being said, I will caution you to be very careful about promoting like an inclusive workplace before you've actually created it. There's actually really depressing research out there which shows that if an employee who's a minority of some sort sees that a company is very outwardly progressive, what they do is they actually make their resume more authentic. So they show more of themselves. They show more of their race, more of their gender, more of their sexuality. And that sounds like a good thing, but if that company's hiring practices aren't good, that actually backfires and leads to a much lower percentage of these sort of minority applicants getting in, because the hiring discrimination kicks in and sort of flags all of these people and kicks them out. So my takeaway from that is only be performative with your inclusivity if you can genuinely back it up with like a good hiring process, or else you're going to be hurting trans people. And I think, you know, that's not something that I can recommend. I can send the research if you're interested. It's very interesting and depressing.
That would be great, Lily. We can definitely include that in what we send out afterwards as well. Just checking if you or Lila got any other direct questions in the chat.
I got one. What is the title of your book? That is Gender Ambiguity in the Workplace, Transgender and Gender Diverse Discrimination. You can look it up on Amazon. It should also, might be in the slide deck. I can include it, honestly. Perfect. Yeah.
Great, and thank you, Raphael, for the citations for Shakespeare's singular use of they.
Oh, I love it.
There are many other uses.
Oh, thank you. I've actually never looked for the exact citations, but that's very good to have. Yeah, Shakespeare used they, them. It was a big surprise to me when I first found that out a couple years ago. So, you know, it's not a new thing. It's in fact a very old thing that we're bringing back.
This is Lila. I have a couple of direct questions that I can answer very quickly. So one of them is asking about the sexual harassment training, and the question is whether the training is once a year or just one training during the course of employment. We want to see this once a year, definitely. Another question, does FEHA apply equally to private and public employers? Yes. What about remedies available for transgender public employees who experience discrimination? The same remedies exist as for private employers for the most part. So you can file discrimination lawsuits. You first have to give notice to government organizations. It gets more into the weeds, but if you feel as if you've been discriminated against, I would definitely contact counsel to discuss your options. And you know, discrimination, what I will note on that is it's very broad. You know, if you feel like you're not being let into a meeting but other folks are, maybe you're being discriminated against, that's, you know, if you're being treated differently in any way, the bathroom issue of course exists. If you're being compensated differently, I think these are all things that you should have a conversation about. And the remedies, of course, you can first give your employer a notice, an opportunity to cure, and hopefully they can fix the issue. But then you can also, you know, unfortunately, if it goes there, you can instigate litigation or a lawsuit, which requires first giving notice to the appropriate organization.
Great. There was another question about FEHA in the chat. Lila, can you see that?
Yeah, does the FEHA law for state of California apply to people in transport industries such as airlines, railroads, trucking, and shipping, where workers may be based in California, but the employer's companies are not? So if I'm understanding correctly, the employer is not or the employee is not employed by a California employer, but they're performing their work in California. You know, I think this.
That's my understanding as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. Is if the employee is performing work in California, then they will be able to access California's laws.
Yeah, great. And just clarifying, when you said the question about the sexual harassment training, that legal requirement is a yearly training then?
Yeah, we should have, based on the changes that were made, the training should be every year.
Thank you. I'm going to give folks more time to post questions, and in this moment, I'll pose a question. Lily, I'm curious if there's anything else we're talking about, like Lila just noted, you know, not being able to get into certain meetings and things like that. They can often feel more direct. One of the things you noted were, you know, subtle microaggressions, oftentimes things that the perpetrator themselves might not be aware of. Are there any things that come to mind, you know, in your work where something in particular for allies, for employers to be aware of, watching out for in the workplace?
Yes.
Things that you want to call out.
So there's an interesting concept that we cover in our book called gender apprenticing, where someone who has positive intentions gives feedback that is unwanted about someone's gender expression. So lots of cases that we saw in the book were times when, let's say, trans women would transition at work, and a cis woman, without asking the trans woman at all, would walk up and say, like, that skirt you're wearing pairs terribly, it makes you look awful, this is what you should wear instead, and I'm gonna give you like a bunch of recommendations for what you should wear. It's usually done with positive intentions, especially like, we actually saw it a lot among women. It's done with positive intentions, but it has the impact of making trans people feel singled out and really bad, because they are basically being told, like, you're not doing woman correctly, like you are not womaning in the proper way. And I believe, you know, that is also a form of discrimination, you know, singling out a trans person for what they're wearing. So this is a really interesting example because it's almost always done with positive intentions. The thing to keep in mind here is don't offer any quote unquote advice without like being invited to, right? Don't do any unsolicited advice giving around anything, especially regarding appearance. It's just not a good idea. So that's something that we saw a lot of. It really messed with trans people. We had one participant who basically said, because of this advice, right, like I was really insecure about how I looked, and I decided to get like 2 extra surgeries that I didn't even want because I was worried that I would be discriminated against if I didn't get them, and it was really bad. On a personal note, I can also remember that time in high school when my physics teacher told me to my face that my handwriting was too masculine, and I spent 2 months completely refiguring out my handwriting from scratch because I was so insecure about it. So it's a very personal story about like something similar that was done with positive intentions but had a really, you know, detrimental effect on me. And it's a common thing that happens to trans folks. So try not to do that. If a trans person asks for advice, definitely help out, and then nothing after that.
Great, thank you.
And this is Lila, I just have one more thing, and I truly apologize, I misspoke. So the sexual harassment training must take place within 6 months of hire or promotion, and then every 2 years thereafter. And that's the new law beginning January 1, 2021, that has to be in effect.
Well, thank you. Awesome. One of the questions was how the courts are handling trans inclusion, including accommodations, but how petitioners, plaintiffs, and defendants are addressed as well in criminal courts. For example, a different message on point was that, for example, Judge Ryu and Judge Spiro have standing orders that encourage litigants to give quote unquote preferred pronouns, and that others can do so. For example, the order is that litigants and lawyers may provide preferred pronouns by filing a letter or adding the pronouns in the name block of the pleadings. So some good back-to-back commentary. There's also a note in the chat from Judge Kolakowski on doing trainings in the judicial sphere as well. I'll say that as an immigration law practitioner, for example, we're always very careful in what information we provide. And we also encourage folks to be careful in how they frame things, especially for transgender clients. And I think it is an opportunity to sometimes educate decision makers and to provide more information. But if others have any comment, if Lila or Lily, if you have any comments about specifically trans inclusion in the judicial system.
Yeah, no, I can't speak to. Yeah, I can't speak to. The criminal judicial system, as I quite frankly don't have experience there. What I can say is it's a work in progress. I can't speak for all courts everywhere. I can say in California, some courts are certainly better than others. The Bay Area, I would tout as being, among better than other counties, but it's a work in progress. It's very judge specific. It's very, opposing counsel specific, courtroom specific. It's, like Judge Kolakowski said, training is in place by some, but not all. And some judges are doing better than others. But this is something where more training is needed.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a quick question in chat about what I said early on was better than gender neutral restrooms. I think that's referring to me saying basically multi-stall is better than single stall if you can do it right, just because having a single stall bathroom tends to result in lines of some sort. Also, in my experience, when you only have a single gender neutral bathroom, the weird thing that happens is cis people will use it for just weird things because it's a private space. So I've talked with all sorts of clients that have cis people just using it to hang out, which is not the appropriate usage of a single stall bathroom, may I add. So either have multiple single stall bathrooms or one multi-stall bathroom with enhanced privacy features is what I was referring to early on, Claudia.
Great, thank you. Another question from me. Lily, do you have any recommendations, or Lila, any recommendations for maybe some open source information on sample policies or things like that, where people can go looking? I'm not sure if some of the companies you've mentioned or others on the Equality Index, for example, are more forthcoming and about those policies so that folks can try to incorporate those.
Yes. Let's see. I recently worked with Stanford University, specifically the School of Earth Sciences, I believe, to develop a model transition guidance that I believe is open source, or at least most of the important aspects of it are open source. So if you just Google search that, Stanford transition guidance, maybe Stanford Earth transition guidance, should give you something interesting. And that was a policy that I built from scratch for them. So that's basically what I would do if I was given free reign of things. I think my own lack of a legal background perhaps makes that not the most useful. So I would also just Google search for, I believe Starbucks policy, is that open source? Has Starbucks made their policy? I read something about that somewhere. I tend to use Starbucks as my model for their benefits, their health benefits. I don't know about their non-discrimination policy writ large, but I do think that they do a good job with their benefits policy.
And then to add to that, and then to add that, the Transgender Law Center actually has really good resources on their website.
Right, that's it. I totally forgot about that one. That's a good one.
And they have, for example, a sample model transgender employment policy for inclusive workplaces,
Yep.
as well as other resources.
Yeah,
Perfect.
Raphael, you mentioned the HRC transition guideline. That's good. Just keep in mind that having a specific timeline is no longer in vogue. So if you are designing a transition guidance or a transition policy, please don't do guidelines as mandatory. It's like one of the biggest outdated things that we're doing these days. So anyone here listening, make a guidance. Have timelines be an option, but don't default to that because it'll make anyone that is non-binary or has a different plan for their transition really uncomfortable. So don't default to it.
Right. Non-mandatory timelines for transition.
Right. Just flexibility for guidelines is always important.
For sure. Another one of the questions was about best practices for asking about information post-hiring around gender. So for example, if you all have a suggestion about whether or not, the example here is, for example, like male, female, non-binary, or perhaps something more open-ended, or an additional box around transgender identity because it's not, you know, one or the other, for example. Any suggestions around like capturing those demographics for, you know, internal purposes?
Yeah, so I get asked this a lot. The very first sort of cop-out answer that I'm going to give is don't ask them this unless you have a good degree of trust and your employees know what you're going to be using that data for. I've seen a lot of companies make a whole bunch of mistakes, and as the first sort of round of apologies try to send out surveys that capture this information, it's not a good idea because no one's going to trust what you're going to do with it, and people will worry that by disclosing, they're going to be retaliated against. So trust before data, right? Trust before data, always. Now, once you've built trust, I think the actual surveying is what you wrote there is actually pretty good. If you're just asking about gender, male, female, non-binary is a solid and simplistic start. If you want a drop-down menu, you can add more identities there, but I think, you know, that's a pretty decent one. You can also ask specific, like I've seen write-in questions that basically say like write your gender. There's a trade-off there between getting responses that your participants really like, but then needing to sort through them and to sort of, you know, classify them yourselves, which requires more time and labor. If your company has thousands of people, it's not usually very feasible. I've also seen drop-down menus work okay. I've also seen questions that say list your gender, male, female, non-binary, and then after that, just a yes or no question, do you identify as trans? And that being a different way to do it too. So those are the two approaches that I think are best in terms of asking for this demographic. But in my experience, it's not what you ask, but when you ask and the context behind your asking that is more important.
Yeah, for example, I work for a nonprofit where we are often asked about demographics of the organization itself in like the grant writing sphere as well. And so we collect that information completely anonymously, for example, because we only need the stats and we don't need the that information connected to an individual's identity, and that context is explained to help foster that trust. So that's
and keep in mind too that if your workplace has one trans person, your survey is not anonymous for that trans person, right? And oftentimes your workplace will have a very small number of trans people. So unless it's absolutely certain that no retaliation will happen, trans people in those contexts either will just not fill out the survey or represent their identity differently. So, you know, just keep that in mind and be very thoughtful around how you do surveying.
for sure. I'm pausing for a moment to see if we have any other questions. Did either of you get anything else sent direct?
Nope, but I really like David's comment.
Yes, thank you,
Policies
David.
must be enforced. Yes, very, very important.
Great. So like I said at the beginning, please feel free to reach out directly as well via email after this presentation. Lily and Lila, are you okay with folks using the contact information up on the slide?
Sure. Folks are also
Yes.
welcome to find me on LinkedIn and message me there. I'm fine with that too.
Great.
Yeah, feel free to
Thank
reach out
you.
with any questions. I'm happy to have a conversation.
Perfect. Thank you both so very much. And thank you to everyone who's participating. I am personally very enthusiastic and very grateful for everyone who's joined on. And maybe it's a silver lining to the fact that we're all sheltering away, that we can get this many people on a virtual presentation. Thank you. I will move forward to the CLE information. For those of you seeking continuing legal education credit, the affirmation code is TRAN526. And I will say that again. But just as a reminder, we are able to provide CLE credit for folks in Arizona, California, New Jersey, and New York. After this presentation, I will send out a uniform certificate of attendance and a program evaluation, which you will not be sending to us. You'll be sending it to someone else. So it will not go directly to us. It'll be anonymized. And again, the affirmation code for those on the phone is TRAN526. And I will also send out, again, a recording of this presentation and these slides after this presentation. And again, feel free to reach out to me if for some reason you missed that or you have any questions. With that, thank you so very much again to our sponsors, to Lila, to Lily, to Raphael for helping with organizing this, and to everyone else who's participating as well.
And to you too. Thanks for hosting.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everyone.